Wasco County Courthouse for inviting me, and Susan Buse, who through persistence over the past 4 years finally got me to prepare this talk on Henry Perkins. Susan also put together the visuals for the talk. Henry K.W. Perkins was founder, actually co-founder with Daniel Lee, of the Methodist Episcopal Mission at Wascopam, which was established in 1838 and lasted for a decade until it passed on to the Presbyterians just before the start of the Cayuse War. The mission constituted the first settlement by American citizens in the area, and it's safe to say it was the forerunner to the city of the Dalles. Those are the basics, but other than that, little about Wascopam Mission's history has made its way into the standard books about the history of Oregon. Probably because of their high political visibility and trips to the East Coast, plus the well-known Whitman killings. Jason Lee and Marcus Whitman are the names most Oregonians know if they know anything at all about the mission history of Oregon. These men were important figures, but as far as success of their missions and positive impact on the native peoples they served are concerned, Henry Perkins was far and away more successful. Another reason for Perkins' relative invisibility is the fact that until 25 years ago, most of his many letters and manuscripts from Wascopam remained unknown and out of sight in archives in Tacoma. Whitman had his biographer, most notably in Clifford Drury. Jason Lee also his biographer, most notably in Cornelius Brosnan. Perkins has never had his biographer, though the story of Wascopam Mission, at least in its early years, has been told. Many of you know my 1996 book, People of the Dalles, the Indians of Wascopam Mission, which was based on the manuscript papers of Henry Perkins and his co-missionaries at Wascopam. What some of you don't know, Susan does, is that the printed volume represents something over half, maybe 3/5 of a larger manuscript, which included biographical material on Perkins and his place in the Oregon, that is the Methodist Mission. People of the Dalles followed a circuitous route to publication. I first became aware of the Wascopam papers in 1977 after reading Robert Lowenberg's book, Equality on the Oregon Frontier, Jason Lee and the Methodist Mission. A wonderful piece of scholarship, though admittedly a tough read. Lowenberg had located the Wascopam papers in the Kantz collection at the Washington State Historical Society Library and the archives of the Pacific Northwest Conference of the Methodist Church at the University of Puget Sound, both in Tacoma. Like I say in the preface to People of the Dalles, what Lowenberg had found intrigued me. I suspected that there was much more than mission history in those documents, and that they might contain gems on local native Upper Chinook and Sahaptin ethnography and culture at a critical time in their history. As an anthropologist, that was my primary interest. Fast forward a decade to the late 1980s, when I approached the Oregon Historical Society Press with an idea for a book on Perkins and Wascopam. With a little bit of support from OHS, I was free to pull it all together and write it up, which I did, and the over 500-page Perkins papers was the result. OHS Press was going to publish the entire thing, but in the early 1990s they hit a financial rough patch, and my manuscript, along with several others, including Mary Schlick's basketry book and Ted Stern's book on Indian-white relations at Fort Nez Perce, were let go. We all submitted to other presses. Washington took the basketry book, OSU Press took Fort Nez Perce, and University of Nebraska took my Perkins papers. But Nebraska didn't want the entire manuscript. They liked the Indian content, but were afraid the mission history wouldn't sell. Plus, the book was too long and jumped back and forth between mission history and native ethnography. Perkins' papers became People of the Dalles. My Nebraska editor picked the title. And we excised my chapters on Perkins the man and his place in the history of Oregon Mission. Some of Perkins' more important documents, his 1843-44 journal, and several articles that were published as a missionary tract, and articles in the Methodist magazine, The Christian Advocate, made it into the book. But I placed the rest aside, and after People of the Dalles came out in 1996, went on to other projects. Then, in the fall of 2012, my how time flies, Susan Buse invited me to come speak in the Dalles in 2013 to mark the 75th anniversary of the establishment of Wascopam Mission. I was in the midst of finishing Chinook and Peoples of the Lower Columbia at the time and couldn't fit it into my schedule, but I told her I'm not saying no, which she took as an invitation to keep prodding me to come speak in the Dalles. So in self-defense, last spring, I returned to the manuscript chapters and reacquainted myself with Henry Kirk White Perkins. This is the printout, I've already seen it, of the lost chapters that Nebraska wasn't interested in. It's not as long as it looks because what I've got here includes the Perkins documents that made it into the book. What I want to do in the rest of my talk is summarize the unpublished chapters. That's not because the native history part isn't fascinating and rich, it is, but that part is already out there and many of you have already read it. There are 11 unpublished chapters and one document. Background chapters on Perkins' early history, Western Oregon 1837, Eastern Oregon in 1838, 6 chapters on Wascopam Mission history, 1 on the Willamette religious revival of 1838-39, and 1 on Perkins' departure from Oregon. Okay. What we know about Henry Perkins' early life comes entirely from his, quote, autobiography. Extant, so far as we know, only in 2 typed and edited versions sent by his granddaughter, Grace Albee, to Reverend John Kantz in 1934 and again in 1952. Although the original autobiography is not available for comparison, it appears that all these modifications amounted largely to omitting sections she found uninteresting. She didn't rewrite it, apparently. Henry Kirk White Perkins was born November 21st, 1814, in the fishing village of Castine on Penobscot Bay in Maine. His father was a sea captain, and he had 7 brothers and sisters. While he was a boy, however, 3 of his siblings and his father died of tuberculosis. Henry went to live with his mother's family, but after yet another sister died, the family fell apart. Henry was apprenticed to the town cabinet maker, with whom he lived for 6 years. During this time, his mother and remaining siblings died too, and at 16, Henry became an orphan. Henry's birth family was not religious, but the town cabinet maker was, quote, a free will Baptist, whose house was open to believers of all stripes, and he subscribed to a religious magazine which Henry devoured. Henry was profoundly moved by a sermon from a Methodist circuit rider and joined the Methodist Episcopal Church. At 18, Henry entered Maine Wesleyan Seminary in Kents Hills, northwest of Augusta. He had a sleeping room in the attic of the men's dormitory and paid his way by doing carpentry work. Henry spent not even 2 years at Kents Hill, and by his own account, his religious training was, quote, deficient. No training in homiletics or speech writing, and, quote, no critical knowledge of the Bible. Despite this shaky background, in 1835, he became a circuit rider out of the town of Mercer. 1836 was the year of change. While at Kents Hill, Henry met a young woman, Elvira Johnson. Though she resided apart, the male and female students shared meals at the women's dormitory. Quote, perilous times for susceptible souls. Propinquity has given many a man a partner for life, the autobiography says. The two were apparently engaged. But Elvira was more religious than Henry, quote, a purer, more truly missionary spirit and zealous, one acquaintance said. And when word came from Jason Lee in late 1835, asking for reinforcements for the Oregon mission, Elvira, quote, offered her services at once, and she was gone by mid-1836. In a state of despair, Henry attended his, quote, first camp meeting at Monmouth, Maine, and during a prayer session had a religious experience, quote, like a shock of electricity, glory, the first touch of divine influence that I was ever conscious of. I should emphasize here that religious revivals and camp meetings were very much a part of the religious landscape in 19th century America, particularly on the frontier, where scattered households came together for services in the open air. The Great Revival started in 1800 in Kentucky, and Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians were all involved. The meetings were very democratic, and laymen could stand up to, quote, exhort, and some had spontaneous physical demonstrations of faith. The, quote, religious experience was very important, almost as much as Bible knowledge in this movement, and Henry Perkins was in this sense very much a man of his time. Both the experience and the word became important in the Wascopam Mission circuit. While Henry was attending the Monmouth camp meeting, Elvira was at sea, circumnavigating South America. Henry was 22, and among the 3 young women in the Methodist first reinforcement, 2 were engaged to men already in the Oregon field, Jason Lee and Cyrus Shepherd. You see where this is going. A call was made for a second Oregon mission reinforcement, and in late December, Henry was at dockside in Boston, ready to sail for Oregon. So here we have a young man, deficient in religious training, but possessed of the Spirit, abandoned once again, if I can psychoanalyze that way, and yearning for his, quote, true lady love. At least in 1837, reuniting with her was his reason for going to Oregon. Elvira was, at the time, the one with the, quote, true missionary spirit. She led the way, he followed. More things happened on the voyage around the Horn and to the Columbia, a span of almost 9 months. Henry had some interesting companions among his shipmates, including the dour and older David Leslie, who would administer the Oregon mission when Jason Lee was gone, and the sharp-tongued spinster, Margaret Smith, best known as author of the first Oregon novel, in quotes, The Grains or Adventures of Ruth Rover. Ruth Rover was a pseudonym for Margaret Jewett Bailey Smith. That's all her married names. Also aboard were 3 other young men, including 19-year-old James Jackson Jarvis, who became the editor of a weekly newspaper in Honolulu, the Polynesian, and who wrote 2 books on Hawaii, and a Mr. Gray, who Henry said was, quote, an infidel. Henry had brought along several books, and the young men apparently discussed them. Miss Smith referred darkly to, quote, the infidel conversion of Mr. Perkins. We don't know for sure what books or philosophy the young men were discussing, but clues point to utilitarianism, quote, an action is right if it tends to promote happiness, and deism, or God is the clockmaker. Thomas Paine's Age of Reason was probably one of the books they discussed. Then in July 1837, Henry ship moored at Honolulu. Hawaii in mid-1837 was undergoing a religious revival, successful from all accounts, of its own under Methodist Hiram Bingham. The Bible was by this time almost completely translated into Hawaiian, and there were several hundred mission schools. But here too, Henry antagonized people. How, we don't know, but the autobiography shows disdain for the Hawaiian missionaries' high lifestyles with native servants and grand balls, and negative letters about Henry, probably from Bingham, but we're not sure, proceeded into Oregon. On September 2nd, the boat arrived at Astoria, where they were shown the giant tree. And shortly afterwards, at Willamette Mission, where Henry met with a, quote, cool reception, even Elvira was distant. But Henry put his carpentry skills to work and manufactured a partition in the mission house so that Elvira's schoolroom was separated from the cooking area. With some intense wooing, love letters survive. The relationship warmed again, and the couple was given the attic in David Leslie's new house, and on November 21st, 1837, they were married. The documentary trail then stops for a full 15 weeks until Henry and Daniel Lee were appointed by Daniel's uncle Jason to establish a new mission at Wascopam. In contrast to the Willamette Valley, where the fever epidemics of the 1830s had claimed a large percentage of native people, there were several thousand natives in the vicinity of the Dalles fishery. Henry's autobiography chapter on the establishment of the mission is reproduced in People of the Dalles. In 2 canoes, Henry and Daniel paddled down the Willamette and up the Columbia, arriving at the 15-house Wascopam village. Wasco means cup made of horn in Upper Chinook, and the suffix pam, people of, in Sahampton, on Mill Creek on March 21st, 1838. The Indians informed them, probably in Chinookwawa, which Daniel had learned, that's Chinook jargon, that others had had a trading post there before. They named the Hudson's Bay Company's James Burney, but besides him, there are sparse references to an American trader, part of Boston man Josiah Marshall's failed attempt to develop a salmon trade on the river in 1829 to 1830. Above and behind the village, on the flat benchland, adjacent to an oak grove, the 2 young men decided to build their mission houses. And here, though it's all in the book, I should stop to say something about the location. We don't know exactly where it was. Back in 1938, Marcella Hilgen said tradition placed it, quote, a block east of Pulpit Rock, or about where the Methodist Church is today. There's been no archaeology done to confirm or to deny this that I've heard of. If anybody else has heard anything, please let me know. Parenthetically, I should point out that there is no mention anywhere in the mission records of Pulpit Rock or missionaries preaching from it, though the tradition passed on by Joseph Luxillo, who was one of the missionaries' interpreters and who survived long enough to be photographed by Benjamin Gifford in 1908 at Pulpit Rock, is probably true. We have 2 surviving pictures of Wascopam Mission itself from 2 vantage points, drawn in 1849 after it had been abandoned. At that time, there were 4 structures. First built was the, quote, stone castle, or small mission house, with 2 rooms below and 2 bedrooms above, occupied by the co-missionaries. In 1839, a, quote, Spanish wattled house was built to the east. It had a chapel below and a schoolroom above. In 1841, a barn and a log meeting house for the natives were built, all surrounded a central plaza. Henry's carpentry skills came in handy in building all these. One thing that is noticeable right away in Perkins' first writings from Wascopam is his open and appreciative attitude towards the natives. There was complete interaction, neither side was standoffish, and Henry was impressed with the elements of Christianity the Indians already knew and their eagerness to learn more. He seems almost excited with this new opportunity in an unknown land and the hope that he might be able to do some good. I quote, "It was a great satisfaction to me to kneel down in the midst of 40 Indians for the first time and commend their souls to God, who cares for the red man as well as the white. I look forward to the time when they would publicly unite their prayers with mine. I just begin to feel I am a missionary and an increasing attachment to my work. These words were written to Elvira at Willamette. She would join Henry in late spring. But before Elvira came, Wascopam was visited by someone who would be the first in a long string of illustrious people who passed through the mission. In this case, none other than Jason Lee, head of the Oregon Mission, on his way to the East Coast with 2 Indian boys, William Brooks, or Stumanu, from Chinook Village, and Thomas Adams, or Clyties, from Willamette Falls, on a speaking tour in order to drum up financial support and recruit more personnel for the mission. The 2 Indian boys spoke at a revival in Peoria, Illinois, and ignited the enthusiasm of the Peoria Party of 1839, the first immigrants intending to permanently settle in the Oregon Territory. Jason also carried with him the Oregon Memorial of 1838, signed by 36 men, urging the United States to take possession of the territory south of the Columbia. Jason preached to a crowd of over 100 Indians in Chinookwawa, which was then translated by Indian interpreters into both Upper Chinook and Columbia River Sahaptin. Jason encouraged Henry and Daniel to teach the Indians agriculture, to learn the native languages, and to, quote, not let the Indians trifle with you. Dr. John McLaughlin, chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company at Fort Vancouver, was also on his way east to London, stopped at Wascopam too. The visits of these 2 notable men must have underlined the importance of the new mission to both younger men, Perkins and Dan Lee. Henry returned to Willamette in April and reclaimed Elvira. On his return to Wascopam in May, he also brought along Winslow Anderson, otherwise known as the first black settler in Oregon. Anderson, along with 2 Hawaiians from the HBC, helped build a mission house, so it was truly a multinational endeavor. Anderson later killed the Molalla Indian Coxstock, the leader of an attack on Oregon City. The incident, which arose from a disagreement about ownership of horses, led to the writing of the 1849 Oregon Exclusion Law to prevent blacks or mulattoes from coming to or residing in Oregon. In September, Daniel returned to Willamette for supplies and cattle and drove 14 head back across the Cascade Mountain trails. In October, Henry and Elvira returned to the home mission as she was expecting her first child and needed medical care. Henry Johnson Perkins was born at Willamette in November. The Perkinses were present at Willamette for what would be the first religious revival in Oregon, on the model of those in the States and Hawaii, between December 30th and January 7th. Those present included mission personnel, French prairie settlers, and Indian school children. Now, the following will give you an idea of the organization of these meetings. A, quote, love feast was held first, and several of the whites arose to, quote, exhort. On the 3rd day, some began to, quote, feel the spirit, and then it passed on to the Indian children, who likewise arose and, filled with emotion, pledged themselves to Christ. Continuous meetings and professions of faith went on for over a week. The whites believed the Indian children had, quote, converted, but the Indian children certainly saw it differently. The mission revival corresponded almost exactly with the time when Oregon Indians held their own winter ceremonies, in which people sang and danced their guardian spirits and performed miraculous acts. There's a parallel here. Perkins noted that many of the Indians were in awe of the whites and their power. The revival is so similar in many ways to the winter spirit ceremonies must have been seen by the Indians as a vehicle to gain some of that power. In the several revivals that were to follow at Wascopam, the same dynamic played out, but on a much grander scale and involving a great many more people. The revivals were crucibles for the mixing of native and Christian religions, and Henry Perkins was at the forefront of the most important of them. Henry was back at Wascopam in February 1839. Most of the rest of that year was uneventful. A garden was started, most of which the Indian women took away. Henry started learning Sahaptin and Daniel Upper Chinook. Henry visited Fort Nez Perce and Walla, and in October, the first Oregon Trail immigrants, the 12-member Peoria Party, passed through Wascopam and were hosted by the Perkinses. In September 1839, 3 other men from the state stopped at Wascopam, and one, Benjamin Wright, stayed until April 1840. The 3 helped build the Spanish wattled house, but then 2 of them plus Daniel Lee departed for Willamette, leaving Ben Wright and the Perkinses at Wascopam. Wright, a restless and mysterious soul, revealed that he had been a Methodist circuit rider in the East. He derided Henry for being like a, quote, congregationalist. That is, practicing the form but not the spirit of religion. And the 2 men began a dialogue of evening sermons. Under Wright's influence, Henry left the, quote, infidel beliefs he had acquired on his sea voyage to Oregon behind and experienced his second spiritual awakening on October 28, 1839. Gradually, Indians began attending the nightly sessions, and, quote, some of them began to pray. The first was Tumsawit, an Indian doctor shaman. There are no pictures of Tumsawit, so we've substituted this painting of a Klickitat shaman by Irving Kaus. And here we need some background on Native culture. Shamans were powerful and influential men with strong spirit helpers that gave them the power to cure. They were frequently wealthy, hosted spirit dances, and were influential in village politics. After praying with Perkins and Wright, Tumsawit began a week when he spent his days, quote, alone among the rocks and hills on his knees, and his nights at the mission house. Though the missionaries may have seen this as, quote, conversion, to Tumsawit it fit the pattern of a native spirit quest. He was gaining a new, quote, power. Tumsawit began to, quote, exhort to the now growing flock at the mission house services. When Daniel Lee returned, sessions started to be held during the day. A second important man, the Equator, or Equator, the village war chief, had a spiritual experience first. Elvira began praying with the women. It was now mid-December, approaching the traditional holy season for both white and Indian. The pattern that had occurred at Willamette a year earlier seemed to be repeating itself. On December 17th, Dan Lee, Ben Wright, Tumsawit, and others started down the Columbia. They stopped at Clackahat at the mouth of the Klickitat River, and Tumsawit exhorted in the native tongue. After a week of continual activity, quote, the sound of prayer was heard in the houses, the woods, and prairies, and 100 were, quote, joined in society. Then to the sister villages at White Salmon and Hood River, Upper Chinook names Klemiaksuk and Nutlitete. I hope I'm pronouncing those right, or at least I'm close. Here one woman fell unconscious for 2 hours and then spent a day in the woods. After 10 days, over 100 people turned to the Lord, and classes with Native leaders were organized. Then on to Skaltape at the Little White Salmon and a village at the Cascades, probably Waihi near present Stevenson. As the brethren made their way down the gorge, Henry Perkins and Equator revisited the villages, quote, preaching, catechizing, and taking the oversight of the classes as far as the Cascades, more than 500 souls. On December 31st, Henry formed, quote, the first native church in Oregon with 40 members at Wascopam. And in mid-January, with the equator, he carried the word upriver to Wishroom or Nishludish village, where he held services in a, quote, cellar formerly used for dancing. There's a story there. After 5 days of preaching, nearly all of the 300 residents attended. Henry then spoke in a large house to 80 people, and the equator spoke also. He took 260 into society at Wishroom, and all told, in early 1840, quote, nearly all of the 1,000 or so upper Chinooks between Wishroom and the Cascades had, quote, become praying Indians. The activity was so time-consuming and overpowering that Dan Lee sent Henry a note from Vancouver telling him to slow down. Quote, I should think your soul had declared war with your body with a fair prospect of destroying the same earthen vessel. A house divided against itself cannot stand. Henry responded by cutting out tea and going to bed earlier, but otherwise continued his strenuous pace. When Daniel Lee traveled back through the gorge in February, he, quote, visited all the villages and found that most had undergone baptism and were, quote, walking the truth. In early spring, Henry and Elvira revisited the gorge villages, and Dan Lee and 2 Indians traveled inland from the North Shore to the Klickitat villages. Then in April, there was a camp meeting at Cowlaps, below the Dalles. Dan Lee said 1,200 attended from all the upper Chinook villages, plus Klickitats and some Columbia Sahaptans. Cowlaps was a flat space, and the teepees formed a circle. There was a week of 4 prayer meetings a day, in between which the Indians worshipped alone. It was an intense indoctrination, and in all, the closely spaced meetings with Indians in early 1840 must have transmitted many elements of Christianity, to say nothing of the spiritual fervor. There was a follow-up camp meeting at Cowlaps in October with Jason Lee present, and although many were off fishing or huckleberrying, 400 attended. Daniel Lee was gratified, quote, I'd rather be a laboring, suffering missionary in Oregon than fill the presidential chair or sway the most potent scepter in the old world. 1839 was the year of most intense instruction of the Wascopam Circus Indians, mostly Upper Chinook, but many Sahaptans too. During Henry Perkins' later years at Wascopam, there were other activities at the mission consolidating it, and a string of visitors, some well-known, who traveled through. In June 1840, Jason Lee returned from the East Coast with the, quote, great reinforcement of some 50 recruits for the Oregon Mission. Wascopam added the farmer, Henry Bridgman Brewer, and his wife, Laura, Dan Lee's betrothed, Mariah Ware, carpenter David Carter, and for a few months, physician Ira Babcock, who was later called Willamette. Henry Brewer set up a farm on a 300-acre prairie a mile below the mission, with wheat and potatoes the biggest crops, though most everything was grown. And the mission became self-sustaining in food, no longer dependent on the HBC at Fort Vancouver. In October 1840, a band of mountain men, irreverent as you might expect, visited Wascopam. The band included Doc Newell and Joe Meek, and Meek recalled the visit in later years to historian Francis Fuller Victor. Both Meek and Newell would become instrumental in establishing the government of Oregon Territory. The mission wives had several children. Elvira, a total of 3 in Oregon, Laura Brewer, another 3, and Mariah Lee, 2. After the addition of Henry Brewer and David Carter lessened his workload, Henry had more time to study Sahaptin. He had been preaching in it since just before the Great Revival. By fall 1840, he had written a speller, and before he left the mission in 1844, he had compiled a Sahaptin grammar and vocabulary and translated large portions of the Bible. None of Henry Perkins Sahaptin's language materials have survived, though there is a small possibility he took them back to New England. More likely, they were left to his successor at Wascopam, Alvin Waller, who didn't bother to learn Sahaptin or Upper Chinook. And my best guess is that they were burned by Perrin Whitman's daughter with most of the rest of Perrin's papers. Other early Sahaptin language dictionaries, such as those of Father Shrews and Pandozzi, have survived. In mid-August to September 1840, the Perkinses visited Willamette, and while there, something happened that dispirited Henry. It was his first visit since the Great Revival. On the one hand, the Willamette missionaries were skeptical and perhaps envious of its success, and behind this there was a doctrinal split in the methods of converting natives. Henry believed that this spiritual experience was enough to bring natives into the church. Those of the Willamette took the longer civilized first, then convert position. After the Perkinses returned to Wascopam, the debate apparently continued among the personnel there, and Dan Lay may have been on the opposite side. The result was, in early 1841, a threat by Henry to leave the mission, which Jason Lay rejected. At the least, this was a rash move by Henry. It certainly showed that he felt his work was not appreciated. But beyond that, it displayed his tendency to become difficult when he felt isolated or backed into a corner instead of trying to work things out. In summer 1841, the flow of visitors to Wascopam picked up rapidly. In July, Joseph Drayton, artist for the U.S. Exploring or Wilkes Expedition, visited. The Wilkes Expedition, modeled after that of Lewis and Clark, produced a multi-volume report to Congress on its findings. The primary source on the Pacific or Northwest on the eve of settlement, their collection of drawings, maps, botanical and geological samples became the foundation of the Smithsonian Museum collections. In August, Governor George Simpson of the Hudson's Bay Company Columbia District passed through. And then Jason and Lucy Lee arrived for a month's stay. And when they left, the first contingent of Oregon Trail immigrants, who were number 24 that year, stopped by. And they were followed by the 100 members of the, quote, Red River Party, Canadian colonials who settled in southwest Washington. The Wascopam missionaries were obliged to host all these diverse travelers. 1842 was rather an eventful year. There was another camp meeting in March, smaller and quieter than those before. There were visits back and forth between Willamette and Wascopam. And while the Perkinses and Lees were gone, a 125-member immigrant party passed through. But the most notable happening was Narcissa Whitman's 5-month, November through March, residence at Wascopam, while Marcus was in the States. In 1843, the signal event was Daniel Lee's departure from the field, which left Henry as the sole missionary at Wascopam. The stated reason for Daniel's departure was the illness of his wife, Mariah, but he had also been stuck in an unenviable position in the dispute between Willamette and Wascopam over the success of the 1840 revival and the conversion versus civilization dispute. And by 1843, he was becoming frustrated with perceived backsliding, that's a quote, among the natives. Probably his expectations were too high. He was also worried about the Oregon Mission's finances. The Lees left Wascopam in August 1843 with the Joseph Frosts from Clatsop Mission. On their return to the States in 1844, Lee and Frost wrote their book, 10 Years in Oregon. Henry was crestfallen and felt abandoned once again. Daniel Lee had been his close friend and companion in arms. 11 days after Daniel left, Henry began writing his long, detailed 1843-44 journal, a rich document full of observations on native culture, which is printed in full in People of the Dalles. Though it is addressed to Charles Pittman, Secretary of the Methodist Episcopal Church, it is written in a conversational style, almost as if Henry were speaking to his departed co-missionary and friend. October 1843 saw several people at Wascopam, Jason Lee, Narcissa Whitman, and Elijah White, all at once. When Marcus Whitman came for his wife on the 20th, he also bore the message that Jason had been dismissed as head of the Oregon Mission. Jason's written response was, quote, "Be it so," which suggests he expected it. Henry Perkins' response is not known, but he gave Jason part 1 of his journal to take back east. Then Wascopam was overwhelmed by the Great Oregon Trail migration of 1843, 875 or more strong. There were some famous names in this group: Jesse Applegate, the writer, Peter Burnett, first governor of California, Asa Lovejoy, one of the founding fathers of Portland, and Morton McCarver, founder of Tacoma. Henry said the mission had become, quote, a hotel. Then after the last wagons left, explorer Lieutenant John C. Fremont, the pathfinder of the West, and his party, including Kit Carson, arrived November 4th, 1843. Following the earlier 1841 Wilkes expedition on the Pacific coast, Fremont had been tasked by Congress to map the area along the Oregon Trail. Fremont's expedition would strengthen the U.S. claim to the territory, and it is believed he had orders to push south to conduct a covert survey of Mexican territory in California. Kit Carson stayed 2 weeks at Wascopam Mission, while Fremont traveled to Fort Vancouver to purchase supplies, returning on November 18th. Augmented by horses and cattle purchased at Wascopam and dragging a 250-pound howitzer, they departed south on November 26th. While at Wascopam, the expedition took on 3 local Indians, including young Billy Chinook, who went with Fremont to both California and the East Coast before returning to Oregon. There is no existing picture of Billy Chinook, so we've substituted, whoops. I guess not, so we haven't substituted an illustration. All right. On June 1st, 1844, the Reverend George Gary arrived at Willamette Mission with instructions to continue the process that had begun with Jason Lee's dismissal. Scale back the mission so that its debts were removed and it was no longer a drain on Methodist headquarters. Clatsop Mission and the Willamette Farm and School were closed immediately. Gary proposed wiping out debt to the Hudson's Bay Company by selling mission land at Willamette Falls to Dr. McLaughlin. Perkins found this distasteful, since McLaughlin's claim at the falls preceded that of the mission, and therefore he thought they had no right to sell it. Characteristically, Henry told Reverend Gary as much and then went a step further, threatening to leave the mission if the sale was carried out. When he had threatened to quit before, Jason Lee asked him to stay, but this time Henry's bluff was called. Unbeknownst to the Perkinses at Wascopam, Gary conferred with Henry Brewer, who was also at Willamette, and asked Alvin Waller, formerly at Willamette Falls, to take over Wascopam. After some vacillation, Waller accepted. In the meantime, Elvira Perkins wrote a long letter to Laura Brewer asking what was going on, and on August 31st, she received Laura's reply. The Garys, Brewers, and Wallers all arrived at Wascopam on September 3rd. It took a while, apparently, for the decision to sink in and be owned by both sides. Gary was surprised when 100 natives showed up for Sunday service and tried to rationalize it away. Perkins wrote Gary a letter retracting his threat to leave, though saying that he heard God calling him to, quote, labor in other lands. Gary picked up on the latter phrase, and Henry was shortly selling his possessions to Alvin Waller. 2 more Sunday services followed, with Perkins speaking in the vernacular to 100 and 200 natives in Waller and Chinookwawa. On September 23rd, the Perkinses and Garys left Wascopam. Joseph Luxilla was said to have, quote, accompanied them to the beach and bade them farewell with many prayers and tears, sorrowing as did the apostles' friends, because he thought to see their faces no more. In his diary, Gary questioned Henry's mental health. Quote, I think he hardly knows what to do. I do not think he is the man to be depended on in this mission, and I have some fear he will make shipwreck of himself in some way when he leaves here. In everything he appears very sincere. He is a mystery to me. In October, the Perkinses stayed with the Gustavus Hineses at Willamette, and on the 26th, since Hines had expressed a desire to leave, Henry asked if he could take his place at Willamette. Elvira was more realistic, but equally torn. In a letter to Mary Walker at Wascopam Mission at Spokane, she decried the sorry state of religion in the Willamette Valley and spoke of her attachment, quote, to the poor Indians whom we dearly love. But said of Wascopam Mission, quote, it has been swallowed up in the world. The Perkins' ship reached New Bedford, Massachusetts on September 1st, 1845, and after that time the documentary trail runs nearly dry. Henry wrote a beautiful letter memorializing Narcissa Whitman to her sister after the Whitman killings in November 1847. But that one letter to Brewer are all from them remaining in the Northwest. I've never been able to visit New England to ransack the archives or trace down descendants of the Perkins children. But the dual facts that since 1996 virtually nothing relevant has appeared in library holdings on the internet, and that I have not heard from any Perkins descendants despite wide circulation of people of the Dalles, tells me that there probably isn't anything, though it would be good to find out for sure, and in particular lay to rest the mystery of what really happened to all of Henry Sapton writings. I have linguist friends who would love to get their hands on that. 2 things have materialized since 1996. The first is a book of poems by Elvira, Harp of the Willows, published in Boston in 1861. It includes poems recalling her time in Oregon, including a, quote, lament on the death of Jason May, who died in 1845, just after he had sent back east to Canada, and a long poem on ransom. The Indian slave boys that the Perkinses rescued from a grave on the Upper Memos Island, and who I also now know lived with Gustavus Hines after the Perkins' departure. Of Henry himself, there was virtually nothing until 2015, when I trolled the internet afresh and found an obituary in totally unexpected, the Congregational Yearbook for 1885. Henry died at 69 in Somerville, Massachusetts. For the years after Oregon, the obit states, quote, Agent, American Peace Society, Cambridgeport, Massachusetts, 1845, local preacher, Vassaville, Maine, 1846, Union, 1847-48, Independent Minister, Hallowell, 1849-52, local preacher, Cornish, 1853, Brownfield, 1854, and a student in theology with Dr. Pond in Bangor. Ordained Congregational at Saco, Maine, 1858. In missionary work, Boston and vicinity after 1856, residing in Boston, 1856 to 70, Cambridge, 1870-77, he's all over the map, and Somerville, 1877, until death of 9 children, 7 are living. A second obituary that Susan found says, after preaching in Maine several years, he came to Massachusetts, where he labored independently in Boston and vicinity, preaching and exhorting at social meetings as opportunity offered. He was a constant attendant at the prayer meetings of the Old South Chapel. During many years afterward, he labored under the patronage of several philanthropic gentlemen. among those who did not attend church anywhere, beginning at first among those sitting idle on the common on Sunday, giving out reading matter to them. He also employed himself in doing good among laboring young men, visiting their clubs, conversing with them, inciting them to good reading and good habits, often furnishing libraries for them, and striving for their elevation in every way. Elvira Perkins died in 1896 and is buried at Cambridge. The aforementioned Grace Albee, Perkins' granddaughter, who sent copies of Henry's papers that she said were, quote, falling apart, to Reverend Kantz, was a spinster, resident in Boston in 1952. I found no record of her after that time. Dr. Kantz, as I said at the beginning of this talk, collected both the Perkins papers from Miss Albee and the Brewer papers from Philadelphia and deposited them in archives in Tacoma, where they reside to this day. There are only 5 copies of Perkins' published tract, Wonderful Work of God, still known to exist, including one held at Reed College in Portland. That's reproduced in People of the Dalles. A few other loose Brewer papers are at Yale. And in 2015, the letter from Henry Bridgman Brewer to his parents, signed Bridgman, written while he was at Wascopam, was offered for sale on an internet auction site for $8,500. Copies of all these papers by Perkins and others really should be in the city of the Dalles and at Warm Springs, because they're part of the city's and the tribe's patrimony. Maybe at some point that will happen. Maybe there also will be a second life at some time in the future for a Perkins biography and history of Wascopam Mission until its abandonment in 1847. Should support materialize and I live so long. That concludes my formal talk and presentation. Does anybody have any questions about Henry Perkins or Wascopam Mission, or I'll open that up. The Indian element that is presented in People of the Dalles. I'll do the best that I can, but bear in mind it's now been over a quarter century since I scoured all the primary documents, and all the details are no longer fresh in my mind. Okay, yeah.
So when the Wascopam Mission was closed, did some of the mission from some other church succeed it? Was there another mission established by some other?
Yeah.
We want the people downstairs to hear the question.
Oh.
Well, want to say it again?
So when after the Wascopam Mission was closed, did some other church have a mission here that continued on?
The Reverend Waller stayed there until it was closed. I think it was just before the Whitman killings in 1847, and then it was abandoned.
And no
So
other church took it up?
No other church, I think there were Catholics there after in the area. But the mission itself, it was gone. There's 3 more years, there's more years here that I don't cover because this is just Perkins. There were Waller papers, but Waller wasn't a very dedicated missionary. He was not at all like Perkins. And he did not learn the local languages, and he preached in Chinook Wallow, which is really difficult to get much from as far as religion is concerned, and passing on a complex idea that just doesn't do it. With only about 300, 500 words, you can't do it. And Henry had spoken, had preached in Sahabton, and apparently Danley in Upper Chinook, and that was exceptional for missionaries in the Northwest to learn the local language. So anyway, there's more years in mission, and there's more documents out there, and there's more work to be done.
Anybody else?
Well, I'll say something more.
I loved your point about how the Indian winter spirit dances kind of seem to dovetail with his approach to teaching, because I actually never heard or thought of that before. So was that an idea you came up with originally?
I was
or
impressed.
did somebody else come up with that?
I was
In other areas of the Northwest, for instance?
I don't think so. I don't think so. When I first saw that, I was impressed. It's the timing, it's the miraculous things that they did, it's the spirit possession, it's the whole thing happening at the same time. And yes, they did dovetail, and it was remarkable. It really hit me with the wonderful work of God that tracked, because of the timing and the explanation of what Tumsowit, the Akuter, and the others went through. It was so much like a spirit quest, you know. And also also unpublished, this is another document that's sitting out there, darn it. The Willamette Mission revival, same sort of thing happened, and there was the Indian children who picked up, and again, the power and the spirit meant something. And it happened at Christmas time, winter ceremony time, same time. I don't know that anybody else has picked up on that.
Can you say more about the disappointment that he felt? I don't know if you use that word, but frustration at the difference between being civilized, or whatever you said, between the people at I guess, at Willamette and Perkins himself, who felt just an experience. So,
Well, you notice he vacillated, went back and forth on that particular thing, and there were times when he thought the spirit was the most important thing, and when he didn't. But eventually he came down on that. But at Willamette, they wanted people to learn agriculture, to learn English, to set up farms, and do all this stuff first, and then they would convert. But Henry was more interested in the feeling, the spirit first. And if you got that, then they were brought into the church. And that was a conflict. But that's really hit more in Lowenberg's book, which is more of a theological treatise.
Anybody else?
There's a lot of stuff here, just an awful lot. And so many tangents.
Okay, well, there's, there'll be time to visit and ask